This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening. Our top stories from East Asia. Australia's Prime Minister cementing a distinct improvement in ties under his administration with what he calls a very constructive meeting with China's president. China's economic growth exceeding forecast, resilience in second quarter exports making up for sluggish domestic demand. Nvidia gears up to resume sales of its H20 AI chips to China following Washington's policy turnabout to lift export curbs it had placed on the US tech giant in April. A cabinet approval for Japan's defense white paper, which repeats a running theme singling out Chinese military ambitions as posing an unprecedented strategic challenge. The successful launch of the Tianzhou 9 spacecraft carrying crucial supplies to astronauts on China's Tiangong space station. And dying trades losing the battle against mass manufacture and e-commerce, but officials in Hong Kong not giving up without a fight. And China's president hailing what he calls a turnaround in ties with Australia, lauding the benefits of improved relations after meeting Australia's Prime Minister in Beijing. Two leaders focusing on trade despite tensions on other issues, including alleged Chinese influence in Australian politics and China's military activities in Pacific waters, specifically around Taiwan and in the East and South China Seas. Mr. Xi calling for setting aside differences in favour of common ground that align with core interests.
过去3年，我们有3次的会晤，就事关中澳关系发展的大略性、前瞻性、方向性、比较深入，也达成了几个共识。 在双方共同努力下呢，中澳关系走出低谷，实现转换，给两国人民带来实实在在的收益。
Always mentioned, Australia's leader calling this meeting constructive. Mr. Albanese stressing the need to put dialogue at the heart of ties, to advance interests while managing differences.
Here and always, I'm guided by Australia's national interests. My government's approach to our relationship with China is patient, is calibrated and is deliberate. And it is aimed at cooperating wherever we can, disagreeing where we must, but engaging in our national interests.
One contentious issue, the Chinese ownership of the strategic Darwin Port, was not discussed. Mr. Albanese's government is considering whether to force its sale to an Australian buyer. The Australian Prime Minister is also meeting with Chinese Premier Li Qiang today to discuss trade, energy transition and regional security. And for more, CNA's Deborah Wong joins us live from Shenzhen. Deborah, this meeting between Mr. Albanese and Mr. Xi focusing deliberately on trade. How do these two sides intend to further the economic ties?
So China has been Australia's largest trading partner for 16 years now, and it's clear that China intends to remain that way. And for Australia, it's the largest exporter of iron ore to China, and it also wants to retain that status. We do know on that front that there are some industry-wide changes happening because China has decarbonization goals to hit by 2030, and so it's also demanding more green iron and on that front. Now, Australia's business delegation on Monday discussed that issue with Chinese steelmakers, and we do know that there were calls to perhaps include a formal agreement. Now, there was no mention of ratifying anything as of yet today, but we do know that several MOUs could be signed in the days ahead, so we have to keep a watch out for that. However, today, both sides still talked about maintaining good bilateral trade ties. We're looking at perhaps in new growth areas like green industries, medical technology, as well as climate change response. And also what seemed like a reference to countering U.S. isolationist trade policies. We saw China talking about working with Australia to uphold multilateralism, to maintain some sort of stability globally as well as within the region, especially to enhance free trade rules and free trade zones. So we're also bilaterally looking at perhaps more people-to-people movements. China did say that it's willing to invite more Australian youth for exchanges and study visits.
All right, perhaps, as you mentioned earlier, more contentious issues quite deliberately not raised by either side. Mr. Albanese pushing for more trade ties despite some reservations.
So even though more of the contentious issues weren't raised, but Mr. Albanese did have a press conference with Australian media after the dialogue. And, many of the questions did revolve around security issues, especially concerns about China's expanding military presence in the region. Particularly, one of the questions also talked about how the PLA did carry out live firing exercises off the Australian coast back in February. And at that time, we understand that the Australian government was not informed were not given prior warning. But back then, the Chinese side did say that they were well within, they're well within their rights to do so. They abided by international law, and that was again raised in the dialogue today. Now, Mr. Albanese also reiterated that same stance today, that the Chinese did act according to international law. Although he did go on to tell the Australian reporters that he was still concerned about the way the exercise happened. Regardless of that, he did emphasize on common interests with China when asked if Australia, like the US, did view China as its greatest military threat. Have a listen.
We have strategic competition in the region, but we continue to engage in order to support peace and security in the region and stability in the region. And that's something that we advocate for, and something I advocated for today.
So in the lead up to the meeting, we understand that US had also pressured Australia and Japan to clarify their roles if China did invade Taiwan. Now, Mr. Albanese reiterated Australia's stance today that it upholds the One China policy and that it also opposes Taiwan independence. Now, the Taiwan issue is a red line for China, and, where countries stand on it does influence the mutual trust and, by extension, trade ties, in fact. So that's something that Mr. Albanese is clear on. He understands, as he did also talk about, keeping lines of communication open with China to prevent any misunderstandings on the security front. Wei Su.
Oh, thanks. That Deborah Wong, they're reporting live to us from Shenzhen. And to take more looks at Mr. Albanese's visit to China, we're joined by Professor Wei Huanzhou from the Faculty of Law and Justice at the University of New South Wales. Professor Zhou, Deborah there saying Mr. Albanese made it very clear where his focus was. If we just bring our minds back to Friday before he left for this trip to China, Mr. Albanese speaking to press that the relationship in China means jobs in Australia. It is as simple as that. Mr. Albanese has been consistent, at least on this.
Oh, thanks for having me. Yes, I think the defining theme of this dialogue or this conversation between the leaders from both sides have focused on economic issues, and particularly trade and how trade can benefit both countries. Given the complementarity in the bilateral relationship on the economic side, it is very important for the leaders to send a very positive message for the entities, companies, and citizens in both countries that they will continue to stabilize and develop the bilateral economic relationship for the benefits of the both countries. And it is, in my view, mutually beneficial if the two countries can continue to expand and deepen their economic ties, particularly international trade, international investment, that will deliver tangible benefits to companies and people in both sides.
Professor Zhou, you mentioned how these two economic models complement each other, so China's economy and Australia's economy. But not so long ago, so specifically 2020 to 2022, we saw China essentially cut off a great deal of Australian exports, vital exports, to the Chinese market. And Australia, in different ways, to different degrees, managed to adjust with that cutoff. So whether or not they're complementary, Australia can exist and even thrive without Chinese support. Now it is back to being dependent on China.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it has been a very reasonable strategy for Australia to think about uncertainties and to diversify its economic dependence and in terms of both imports and exports. But if you look at the facts that during that bilateral tensions, Australia's exports were hit very hard and find very difficult to navigate different markets apart from China. And when China removed the trade restrictions, Australia's exports very quickly returned to Chinese market. And that is a very significant and clear sign to me that the complementarity in both the economic needs and supplies of both countries remains very strong and continues to determine the international trade and economic relationships between the two countries.
Perhaps a few years ago, if Australia talked about economic coercion, it might have been thinking of Beijing. But now when it talks about economic coercion, it's likely thinking of Washington. So there's one unifying factor there for both these economies, different in size, but with reason to look to each other.
I think it is important to make sure that there is a diplomatic channel for both sides to communicate their disagreements and views and position on all sorts of issues, not only economic issues, but also political and strategic positions on different, perhaps more sensitive matters. And these are very key aspects in diplomacy and international relations between big powers. And economic coercion, it depends on how you define it. I think the way I want to see it is that I think this world has been facing significant uncertainties and challenges, and every country may be a victim in these uncertainties, unpredictability. And if a larger country exercises influence by using trade restrictions or trade measures, and that will have an impact on many other countries. So I think it is very important for...
Pardon me for cutting it. You mentioned the importance of diplomatic channels, such as this meeting between Mr. Albanese and President Xi, and that matters. And in a way, they could have used this meeting, the second for Mr. Albanese, to raise precisely these sensitive and contentious issues, such as the port in Darwin. This is a wasted opportunity.
I think, again, both sides send a very strong signal that they want to make sure this dialogue to be a positive dialogue that re-engage each other on important trade matters on the positive sides. They said very clearly, I think, that they will manage the disagreements. But again, I think the key message from this meeting is to show the world that the two sides have very strong political will to collaborate on trade and economic issues and to push through existing relationships and collaboration, but also potential areas for collaboration. Now, they may find a different venue to discuss these security or more sensitive issues, but I think it is very important for the leaders to set a very clear theme and sign for this dialogue.
All right, a final question here. It's easy to dismiss diplomatic meetings like these as just a chance for a photo opportunity, but they serve, from your point of view, they serve an important function when you have differences to actually be able to meet and lay out the precise points of your difference so that you can address them and where you can find some kind of compromise. Final question.
Precisely. I think the most important message and function of this dialogue, or achievement, if you like, is the reassurance of the diplomatic channels and diplomatic dialogue that will continue to provide mechanisms for the both sides to consult with each other, even on their most important disagreements. For example, some of the sensitive issues that we recently heard about, Port of Darwin, and those are issues that could be dealt with more diplomatically through this consultation mechanism.
Thanks so much for joining us this evening, Professor Wei Huanzhou from the University of New South Wales. And still ahead on East Asia tonight, we unpack China's latest GDP numbers with an economist. We look into the US decision to allow more Nvidia chips to flow to China once again. And Roland Lim joins us with the business news. Roland, we've got figures for China's second quarter for the economy. You're going to be telling us what they mean.
Thanks, Rachel. Yes. The world's biggest exporter shrugged off the impact of Donald Trump's trade war with exports, making up for the lack of domestic demand. GDP expanded 5.2% in the second quarter from a year earlier. That beat economists' forecast for 5.1% growth, but comes in lower than the 5.4% expansion recorded in the March quarter. Strong factory output helped offset some of the weakness in the economy. Industrial production rose nearly 7% in June from a year earlier, with output accelerating from the month before and beating forecasts. Retail sales in June, though, slowed to 4.8% from a strong 6.4% gain in May. And for a deeper dive into the numbers, we're joined now by Gary Ng. He is senior economist at Natixis, joins us live from Hong Kong. Gary, good to have you on the show as always. China's economy grew better than expected, but are we seeing clear signs of deceleration? I mean, how much investor confidence should there be in the second half?
Well, if we first look at what is behind this seemingly positive momentum, it is really this front-loading demand that has helped China's export, which has indeed also boosted the industrial production as well. And beyond that, we also see some subsidies for consumers in terms of their spending, etc. However, how long it can actually last really depends on whether this geopolitical tensions will actually escalate further and whether China will continue its demand-side policy. Because from what we see so far, I think we do observe some significant pressure on prices, which is still quite concerning for the Chinese economy. And if you look at the property investment, the recovery in the home market has been rather subdued at the moment. And together, when you also look at investment side for manufacturing, things are already slowing down because companies are adjusting to this overcapacity issue because there's not enough demand. So with all of this in mind, it seems that the positive momentum may not be as great as what we see in the first 2 quarters of this year. Things will slow down the road.
Okay, but one bright spot, though, we are seeing strong export growth to Southeast Asian markets and Europe as well. And signs of this rerouting of trade to bypass US tariffs. Could this at least signal to investments out there opportunities in China's supply chain partners or even logistics hubs in ASEAN?
Well, I would say that Chinese firms are trying very hard to offset the impact from the loss in the US market. And of course, some of this trade may be the rerouting activities that maybe goes through Vietnam or some other countries towards the US and the end demand. With this is actually possible. but it really very much hinged on the ultimate arrangement of the trade deal. We're not so sure about how the US would trade all these goods made by Chinese companies in ASEAN and also other countries for the re-export to the US. This part is really uncertain. So I think what we see so far is really about China exporting its deflationary pressure towards the rest of the world in exporting the goods, its excess capacity, and whether that will create more investment and create more jobs to other countries. I think this is, to me, the biggest question mark that we need to look at, and we're not so certain about this for now.
Retail sales growth, of course, slowed sharply in June. Private investment still declining, with the 300 billion yuan trade-in program losing steam as well. What's the state of China's domestic demand story right now?
Well, 300 billion yuan in the Chinese economic term is basically around 0.2% of GDP, which is not an exceptionally huge amount, but it does serve as some stabilization effect on the retail sector, for example. So what we see is that there has been some preferential support towards the certain products, but whether this will really last further will really depends on whether China can regain its nominal growth. And because we do see that wage growth has been decelerating because of this negative and more cautious sentiment, the wealth effect hasn't been really that strong. So without improvement in these two indicators, how long can the subsidies last? I think this is really the biggest question that we should ask ourselves when we look at the Chinese economy. So yes, I would wait for any significant improvement in these two indicators to conclude any more, prolonged improvement on the consumption side to mitigate this impact from the so-called downgrading.
So GDP growth first half 5.3%. Is it likely that Beijing will then hold back on large-scale stimulus in the third quarter? I mean, what should investors be expecting from the upcoming Politburo meeting?
Well, indeed, there is a policy risk that the policymakers may think that the economy is on track towards the annual growth target, and then it can backtrack some of these policies, especially when there's such a big uncertainties on geopolitics that things can turn bad or maybe become less intense as expected. So I guess from the communication we have seen over the past few weeks, there is indeed some cautious approach, for example, in the monetary policy, in not lowering interest rates further for a short while. But eventually, if we do not really see significant improvement in some of the core sector, such as real estate, and if economic data does massively decline or get worse in Q3, then it's possible that we see some ramp-up policy starting in Q4. So I would say that yes, there is a risk that things may move a bit slower in the short run.
Gary, good to talk to you. Thanks for those insights. That was Gary Ng, senior economist at Natixis in Hong Kong. Nvidia announced it will resume sales of its H20 artificial intelligence chips to China, marking a major shift in US export policy as trade tensions between Washington and Beijing eased. The H20 chip was designed specifically for China to comply with previous curbs during the Biden administration. It was banned in April this year due to national security concerns. Nvidia took a hit of more than $20 billion from the halt of those sales. But now Washington has assured Nvidia that export licenses for the H20 will be granted. And that's a big win for Nvidia's chief executive, Jensen Huang, who lobbied hard for this to happen. I spoke to reporters shortly after the announcement.
So we will start to sell H20s to the Chinese market. And I'm looking forward to shipping H20s very soon. And so I'm very happy with that very, very good news.
Nvidia still can't sell its most advanced chips to Chinese customers, and that makes H20 even more vital for cutting-edge data centers that train AI models and operate AI applications. Both the H20 and Nvidia's flagship H100 chip use the company's Hopper GPU architecture. The H20 is significantly scaled down in terms of computing power, though some analysts say that brings benefits of improved efficiency. And under certain conditions, it can be better for large language model inference. Regardless of the comparisons, there is still strong demand for the H20s in China, particularly after the launch of DeepSeek, sparked a surge in the usage of AI across the country. Leading AI players, including ByteDance, Alibaba, and Tencent, were major buyers of the H20 before the ban took effect. Now, the chip costs between $12,000 to $15,000 each. Mr. Huang also announced plans to release a new AI chip designed specifically for China.
The second news is that we're also announcing a new GPU called RTX Pro. And RTX Pro is very important because it's designed for computer graphics in digital twins and AI.
Now, Nvidia rose about 4.5% in early trading in the US, with Hong Kong-listed tech stocks also rallying on the Nvidia announcement. And that'll do it for business. Risu.
And thanks for that, Roland. And still ahead on East Asia tonight, Japan calls China's military activities a grave concern of that finding in this year's defense white paper, which also lays out plans for how Tokyo intends to meet that challenge. We'll speak with Stephen Nagi from the International Christian University for more insights on the white paper. Plus, public unhappiness in Japan over rising numbers of foreigners already being blamed for discontent with the ruling coalition. It faces a tough fight in upper house elections on the weekend. This is East Asia Tonight, and these are the headlines. China's economic growth exceeding forecasts, expanding 5.2% in the second quarter from a year earlier. Resilience in exports making up for sluggish domestic demand. Nvidia announcing it will resume sales of its coveted H20 AI chips to China, marking a major shift in U.S. export policy in signs of easing trade tensions between Washington and Beijing. And China's president hailing what he calls a turnaround in ties with Australia, lauding the benefits of improved relations. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese calling the meeting very constructive. Our Chinese President Xi Jinping says Beijing always prioritizes diplomacy with its neighbors. He was speaking to foreign ministers of member states of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
成功走出了一条顺应时代潮流 契合各方需求的区域合作道路，树立起新型国际关系的典范，维护好地区安全和稳定，促进成员国发展繁荣，打造紧密的命运共同体。
The 10-nation grouping, seen as a counterweight to Western-led blocs, will convene again later today for the SCO Foreign Ministers meeting in Tianjin. Iran is expected to meet Chinese and Russian partners on the sidelines, aiming to shore up support following last month's 12-day war with Israel. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov separately meeting with the Chinese leader after talks in Beijing. They discussed regional issues as well as a trip by Russian President Vladimir Putin to China in September. Ahead of that SCO meeting, President Xi also meeting the Indian Foreign Minister. This is Dr. S. Jaishankar's first visit to China since a rupture in relations in 2020. Over deadly clash along their disputed Himalayan border. Ties have improved since an agreement reached last year to reduce tension. Japan has released its annual defense white paper calling China's military activity a grave concern. It also raised alarm bells over the speed of North Korea's missile development. CNA's Michi Ishida tells us more.
The white paper highlights the increasing presence of the Chinese military around Japan in the past year, such as near the disputed Senkaku Islands, which China also claims and calls Diaoyi. Japan says the Chinese military aircraft violated Japanese airspace for the first time in August last year. And in September, a Chinese aircraft carrier sailed close to Japanese waters. The white paper notes that Beijing held drills frequently around the Taiwan Strait, very close to Japan's Yonaguni Island in 2024, in a move seen as aiming to boost its combat readiness. China and Russia's joint drills around Japan are seen as a concern too, and another sign of the increasingly severe and complex security environment. The white paper says North Korea's level of threat has risen, pointing out that Pyongyang has launched hypersonic missiles. In response to growing security threat, Japan has launched a new command to better integrate its ground, maritime, and air forces. The country is also upgrading its standoff missile capability. Japan's defense budget is expected to rise to 1.8% of its GDP this fiscal year. The increased defense expenditure from about 1% is part of then Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's national security strategy announced in December 2022. But it needs to recruit more personnel. Japan's self-defense forces recruited only 10,000 out of a targeted 15,000 personnel last year. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has introduced new benefits and allowances to attract more recruits. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
And to help us assess Japan's defense white paper, we speak to Stephen Nagi. He's Professor of Politics and International Studies at International Christian University. He's speaking to us from Budapest. Professor Nagi, this is a yearly white paper from Japan. What we see this year does not break, in essence, from what we have seen in previous years, or does it?
That's exactly right, Wei Su. Every year, the Japanese Ministry of Defense releases a white paper on the defense challenges that Japan is facing. And it looks at it from the perspective of defense, because Japan has what's called Article 9 of this constitution, meaning that it's given up the right to use force as an instrument of foreign policy. So its assessment is about defense, how it can manage the challenges. And what we see year by year, 2024 to 2025, is a real focus on China's expanding military presence across the region, the challenges of North Korea, and increased cooperation of Russia within the Indo-Pacific region, and how the Ukraine front and the Ukraine war is connected to the Indo-Pacific security challenges.
But the larger region, so globally, certainly within the region as well, there are significant changes. Oh, there's a change in administration in the White House, certainly between last year and this year. So this white paper, does that take that into account?
Well, I do think that this white paper is also a message to the Trump administration that Japan is taking its security seriously, that it identifies the same challenges the White House, that is China's revisionist behavior within the Indo-Pacific region, its interest in pushing the United States out from what's called the first island chain and the second island chain, its interest in reunifying with Taiwan as quickly as possible, its assertive behavior in the South China Sea, and lastly, and I think importantly, North Korea's increased cooperation with Russia in terms of sending troops to Ukraine, but also that critical technology that we think Russia is providing to North Korea to refine its intercontinental missile systems, as well as other missile systems that can be used to attack Japan, but also U.S. bases within the region in Japan, South Korea, and of course Guam and other places in the region.
We'll get to North Korea in a moment. I'd like to push a little further on this. If this is a message to the White House, which right now is very focused on seeing or making sure that each country is doing enough for its own defense, and also that each country, as an ally, as Japan is, can contribute to U.S. defense as well. If this white paper is delivering this message to Mr. Trump in the White House, do you see it having managed to do that?
Well, ultimately, the White House would like Japan and other allies to spend much more in the region. Elbridge Colby, this Deputy Secretary of State, has put forward and came to the region and asked, whether Japan and Australia would actually do something if there was a Taiwan contingency. And they want to get some clarity, transparency, because for the United States, if Japan and Australia and other allies are not going to step up to the plate and support the United States defending Taiwan and ultimately defending the interests of both Japan and Australia, but also other states within the region, then the question is, from the United States standpoint, why should we be involved? And, that's the cold calculus of the Trump administration. The Trump administration has moved away from, I think, those concrete security guarantees that previous administrations have given without those partners giving the same concrete commitments to helping the United States on some of the challenges within the region. And I think that is the key message that Japan is sending to the United States, while at the same time sending a message to China that it hasn't deviated from the one China policy, that it encourages peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. And ultimately, the question of Taiwan and China needs to be decided by the Chinese people and the Taiwanese people themselves through peaceful dialogue. And in that sense, the white paper is a message for the United States and for China that Japan is willing to commit to its own defense, to helping the United States, but also preserving peace and stability within the region and preserving the one China policy.
Mr. Nagi, on that question that Mr. Colby posed to Japan and Australia, what will you do if China should invade Taiwan? From my reading, neither Japan nor Australia gave it that transparent, clear answer that Washington might have asked for. This is one part of the question. The second is, if Japan wants to give a clear answer on what it's doing for its own defense, as well as in aid of the United States, it might have done so with a larger number in terms of pledge for defense spending, certainly by 2027. Did we see that in this white paper? Final question.
So the first question is ultimately very difficult to answer. What would you do if there was some kind of Taiwan contingency? And it really depends. If it's a blockade, if the Chinese decide to use cyber attacks, if the Chinese actually go through a full-fledged military invasion, these are all different equations. And I think the Japanese and the Australians have made the right choice to focus on strategic ambiguity, saying it depends and not making any kind of public commitment. These are the kinds of discussions that go behind closed doors. On your second question, has Japan done enough? Well, in 2022, it committed to doubling its defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2027. It's got to about 1.8% in very creative ways. We call it creative accounting in my circles. And we don't really think it's going to be possible to get to that 2% unless that creative accounting continues. There's a lot more to be done in terms of spending, in terms of defense capabilities and the capabilities to deal with the challenges within the region. But at the same time, there's a lot more to be done in terms of diplomacy, engagement, and creating the spaces for dialogue with the challenges and the stakeholders within the region. I think Japan and its defense white paper stresses both deterrence, but also engagement and diplomacy. And that's going to be important for peace and stability in the region and dealing with the challenges moving forth, but also seizing opportunities.
Oh, thanks so much for joining us this evening. Stephen Nagi, Professor of Politics and International Studies at International Christian University. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's ruling coalition in Japan is on shaky ground ahead of upper house elections due on Sunday. Our polls show the Liberal Democratic Party and its partner Komeito in a struggle to hold on to the 50 seats they will need to keep in order to keep their majority in the upper house. Voter frustration over high living costs and rising food prices make it made worse by Mr. Ishiba's refusal to cut the sales tax. Adding to discontent, a growing number of foreign arrivals. The government launched a new agency today to tackle foreigner-related crime, over-tourism and real estate ownership by non-citizens. Ms. Ishiba acknowledging rising public anxiety over disorderly conduct and misuse of services by some foreign residents, with public discontent giving a boost to the populist Sanseto party with its Japanese First platform. The polls are also limiting options available to the government as it tries to seal a deal with the United States before steep tariffs kick in on the 1st of August. Tokyo has maintained it will not sacrifice its agricultural sector, traditionally a key voting bloc for the ruling party. Mr. Ishiba is arranging to meet U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in Osaka on Friday. Taiwan President William Lai is set to lead a business delegation to Central and South America next month, which will include a stop in Belize, one of Taipei's 12 diplomatic allies. Paraguay, also playing host, President Santiago Peña says his country is ready to defend decades-old ties based on, quote, democratic principles and values. But he stressed that Paraguay does not disregard China. Visits by Taiwanese presidents to Central and South America are often accompanied by what Taipei officially calls stopovers in the United States. China launched military drills around Taiwan after President Lai's first overseas trip last year, which included stopovers in U.S. territories Hawaii and Guam, during which he held video calls with multiple senior U.S. officials. China considers Taiwan to be its own and has consistently opposed what it calls sneaky visits to the U.S. by the island's leaders. Still ahead on East Asia tonight, heavy rains lash parts of Japan as a tropical storm makes a rare landfall in the northern island of Hokkaido. And Hong Kong leader John Lee throws his weight behind a bill that recognizes limited rights for same-sex couples. Tropical storm Nari made landfall in Hokkaido early today, the first storm in almost a decade to hit this far north. Torrential downpours battering parts of central and eastern Japan, prompting warnings of severe disaster. The regions of Tokai and Kanto Koshin could be drenched with up to 150 millimeters of rain in the 24 hours through tomorrow morning. Authorities have warned of mudslides and floods in low-lying areas, urging caution against lightning strikes, hail and even tornadoes. Heavy rain expected to persist through Thursday, with the Tokai region likely to get the worst of it. China successfully launched its cargo spacecraft Tianzhou 9. The rocket blasted off in the island province of Hainan early this morning, bearing supplies of around 6.5 tons. Tianzhou 9 brings life support materials to astronauts on the Tiangong space station, plus spacesuits, exercise equipment and scientific payloads related to space medicine and other experimental fields. The Tianzhou 9 also marks the first use of a spacecraft that can be launched quickly if needed. From launch to docking, the entire process wraps up in a matter of hours.
就从最开始的2天到6.5个小时，到现在我们常用的，基本上已经形成一个固定模式的一个3小时快速交互对接。这样的话，首先我是资源最省的，我能够省燃料；第二，我时间也不长；第三，我有很多自主控制，保证了我交会对接的这个可靠性。
Hong Kong leader John Lee has backed a bill recognizing limited rights for same-sex couples. But opposition from the legislature could sink this bill. Mr. Lee's administration proposed the bill recognizing some rights for marriages registered abroad. But pro-Beijing politicians who dominate the legislature have criticized the proposal. There's also opposition from conservatives within Mr. Lee's camp. In 2023, Hong Kong's top court quashed a bid to recognize gay marriage, but ordered the government to create, quote, an alternative framework for same-sex couples. Activists have criticized the bill, which only covers rights related to medical matters and, quote, the right to handle after-death arrangements. While China has not legalized same-sex marriage, Hong Kong is a special administrative region that has its own mini-constitution. Hong Kong on a bid to transform itself, going strong on advanced technologies such as artificial intelligence. One obvious impact is the city's traditional handmade crafts that are slowly giving way to technological modernity. In this first of a 4-part series, CNA's Mei Wong looks at how some of the traditional products and craftsmen may soon be calling it a day in Hong Kong.
A carve here and a chisel there. Within seconds, Uncle King is able to carve out the character on a mahjong tile. That's effortless for the 72-year-old who has been perfecting this craft since he was 10.
我已經係數起上嚟，我就係第3代。如果我諗咧，消失就一定㗎啦，睇下幾耐時間嘅啫。好似我哋而家呢輩咁嘅年紀，香港冇幾多個做㗎咋嚇。
Uncle King has 3 children with their own careers and none will be taking over his business. He didn't really teach his children the craft because he didn't see a future for them in this trade, even though mahjong is deeply rooted in Hong Kong's culture.
工作坊就好多，呢輪就好多工作翻嚟學下玩下研究下點樣做法一隻麻雀咁係有。正式學咧，我都嗌佢唔好學啦，都揾唔到食。
In 2014, hand-carved mahjong tiles were recognized as one of Hong Kong's intangible cultural heritage items. But living on much longer may not be possible for these traditional handmade beaded slippers.
拖鞋買嘅拖鞋款式太多啦，以前同時好多着我哋啲拖鞋嗰批好多都已經比較年紀大啲，好多已經走咗啦，咁樣變咗係少咗一批客咯。
Though this store specializes in beaded slippers, what's on the shopfront display, however, are cheaper mass-produced shoes. Most consumers today pay less attention to exquisite craftsmanship. E-commerce and technology are also threatening the survival of such a brick-and-mortar retail store.
以前咧就冇嗰啲電腦車花同埋有人手做嘅。 但係依家啲車花全部都係電腦車花㗎啦，但係黐掹咧都係用人手嘅。如果人手繡啊，你一日都唔繡得1、2對啦。
Hong Kong authorities are hoping to preserve these cultural products and stories so that future generations can continue to appreciate them. The city set up the Hong Kong Intangible Cultural Heritage Centre in 2016, exhibiting a variety of traditional crafts.
Intangible cultural heritage is an important part of the Chinese history and also the tradition. So we want to arouse the people's awareness and their interest in this aspect.
Last year, the Intangible Cultural Heritage Office organized 1,400 activities, such as performances, demonstrations, and seminars, both within and outside of the center. That helped to attract more than 130,000 people to the center. It's hoped the center will not just help enhance visitors' understanding of Hong Kong's traditional crafts, but to preserve this invaluable piece of the city's history. May Wong, CNA, Hong Kong.
And that's East Asia Tonight. Headlines anytime at cna.asia, plus we're on Facebook and YouTube.